I wanna be a producer with a hit show on Broadway. I wanna be a producer.
Hey everybody, it's Ken. Listen, has this ever happened to you? Someone comes up to you the morning after a big opening and says, "Did you read the Times review?" And you didn't. Little awkward, right? You want to feel in the know? Well, that's why I started the website didhelikeit.com. Didhelikeit.com will tell you in a snapshot whether Ben Brantley or Charles Isherwood or whoever reviewed the latest show liked the show, hated the show, or just thought it was so-so. So check out didhelikeit.com, subscribe. You'll be the first one to know whether he liked it or not. And it's a brand new app in the iTunes store. So download it today. Okay, now on with the podcast. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Producer's Perspective podcast. I am Ken Davenport, and today I'm very pleased to have as a guest on the podcast the lead producer of one of Broadway's newest big fat hits, American in Paris. Welcome, Stuart Oken.
Thank you. Great to be here, Ken.
Stuart is yet another example of how everyone's road to becoming a producer on Broadway is a little different. I'll let Stuart tell you all the details of how he got to where he is today, but I will tell you and give you a little bit of a clue that he spent a chunk of his career as a high-powered exec at a company no one has ever heard of that has had no influence on Broadway whatsoever called Disney. After Disney, he formed his own production company, which went on to produce shows like The Addams Family, and now he's leading the team on that big hit at the Palace that I think did $1.4 million last week. So, Stuart, tell me how you got from where you started to $1.4 million a week. What was the path?
Oh, my goodness. Well, you know, I'm in my 60s, and I've been working at it a long time. And when I was a kid, I would sit with my grandfather in Chicago, and I would read the back of the record albums of the Broadway musicals and imagine the stories as we played the songs, and I memorized the lyrics. And I fell in love with Broadway. I fell in love with the Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals and the Lerner and Loewe musicals and West Side Story and the earliest Stephen Sondheim. And I never imagined for a minute that that would be my life, but it was just caught deeply in my heart. And as I grew through the years, I had an opportunity to kind of become part of the Chicago theater community in the early 70s, where we didn't do anything close to those kind of musicals, but we were doing David Mamet and early Steppenwolf and the kinds of plays that kind of shaped more off-Broadway and nonprofit theater of that period. And I actually ran a nonprofit in Chicago for about 3 years before building a commercial theater in Chicago. And that was very unusual, to open a commercial off-loop, off-Broadway-esque theater in 1978. It was the first time it had ever happened, a new building. And I kind of pegged myself as a young commercial producer, but slowly learned that that's a pretty tough place to be, because as any community grows more sophisticated, the costs go up and you can't take the risks you were taking when you could produce a show for $15,000 or $20,000 because everyone just wanted to do it. So I had to figure out a path. And my path was in the commercial side of the business. And so I kind of went from there. I built the Apollo Theater in Chicago, where I produced for about 10 years between 78 and 88. In maybe 82, 83, I bought the rights to David Mamet's play Sexual Perversity in Chicago, which was a show that I had produced twice, first at the Organic Theater in Chicago, where it had its world premiere. And then when I opened my own theater, I produced it again there, and I bought the film rights. And it took about 3 years, and I did it completely outside the system, but we got TriStar to make the film. It was called About Last Night. It was the kind of weakened title from this great Sexual Perversity. I remember saying to them, why did we buy this title if we weren't going to use this title? Because it was called Sexual Perversity in Chicago till the last minute before it was released. But it became a hit film, and it opened the door for me to have a film career. And I sold the theater in Chicago because, boy, it was tough to make a living. And I went to California and was in the movie business for 10 years. And it was an interesting time. I learned a lot. I worked on a lot of projects. I had a hit film, which is very unusual to kind of come into town with a hit movie. And then I got this call from Tom Schumacher at Disney at the time. Tom and Peter Schneider were running the animation division at Disney, where the movies of that period, The Beauty and the Beast, The Lion Kings, the movies that became the Broadway hits, but that was really the Renaissance. The Renaissance happened in feature animation in that late 80s period where Menken and Ashman were really the ones that were kind of teaching them all how to make a cartoon into a musical. And it was a very successful marriage. Anyway, well, Beauty and the Beast had just opened on Broadway, and it came out of the theme park division at Disney. It didn't even come from the guys that, like Tom and Peter, who ended up running the theater division. They did not do Beauty. They inherited it. And when it was successful on Broadway, they were told, we're in the theater business now, and you guys are going to run it. And they were not sure they even wanted to be in it, but remind yourself, if you can, how many new musicals opened in 1994? Can you peg that? You're smart. You probably know.
In 94, that was the Beauty year, was Sondheim, Passion, and A Grand Night for Singing. Was that around
you're
that
right.
time?
You're completely right. You're so smart.
That was the year I graduated.
That was it.
Yeah,
That was it.
2.5 shows.
And Grand Night for Singing was not considered a new musical, so there were 2 new musicals nominated for Tonys, 2 opened. That was it. And it was the last new Sondheim musical and the first Disney musical. And say what you will, it was a turning point for the industry. You could get a theater at that time by knocking on the door. There were empty buildings all over the place. And really that was the turn. And Michael Eisner recognized it. And he said he wanted the company to be a presence. So Tom Schumacher called me up. I knew Peter Schneider from Chicago. We both ran theaters in Chicago in those early Chicago days. And I said, I'm not going back to the theater. The theater broke my heart. I'm in the movie business now. And he said, come on, just talk to me. Let's just talk. And we went to lunch and we sang show tunes. And I went, damn, I think I'm going to have to take this on. And it was like, really? Broadway was all I ever wanted to do, ever. Didn't want to really do the off-loop theater in Chicago. It was a reaction to not being able to do Broadway musicals. And the movies was a reaction to not making much of a living doing off-loop theater in Chicago. And there it happened. And we went on from there and we built the division. And we did The Lion King and Aida. And I stayed 10 years. And it was a wonderful gift to me to turn me back to the path that I originally wanted to take.
I have so many questions about you popping all over the country like this. But let's go back to Chicago for a little bit and sexual perversity in Chicago. First of all, do you remember how much you paid for the rights?
Yes. I paid $7,500 for the rights and another $50,000 for a screenplay.
And did David write the screenplay?
He did write the first draft of the screenplay. He wrote it for another producer before. Another producer had bought the rights before I did, and I bought it from him. And he had written a screenplay for that guy, and they had a falling out.
I'm just wondering about what his reaction was when the title was changed from Sexual Perversity in Chicago to About Last Night.
I think his reaction was put in place when he didn't end up becoming the person to write the script for the film. I was a friend of his. He actually wrote a curtain raiser, a new piece to go with Sexual Perversity when we did it in Chicago, but he was not happy with me when I wouldn't produce his screenplay as written. He thought it was done, and so be it. We hired some other writers and we went with it. So we haven't really been on those kind of sharing more stories since then.
I won't ask you to quote what he said exactly, because I try to keep the podcast clean a little bit. So you're at Disney now in a position that you're surprised to be in and working on theater again. And it's different than most theater positions in that before that, especially Broadway producers or developing shows were individual guys like you are now, like I am. And here you are in this corporate environment, having been in this very small town, if you will, Chicago. I know a bunch of people, let's put on a show mentality. What was the corporate structure like? How was that to obviously a lot of things become very easy to do when you have the money and resources, but it must be challenging.
Tom and Peter were coming out of a period where feature animation, which I guess Jeffrey Katzenberg, Michael Eisner, those earlier days, that Peter then became president and Tom became executive vice president and Tom eventually became president. But that was the brain trust of Disney. It was the most creative central place where they were making stories and making characters and feeding the theme parks and feeding all aspects of the company. I say that because it's a way of explaining that it operated like a small business, the theater division. We certainly had financial reporting, there was HR, there were a lot of corporate aspects that we paid deference to, but the actual way we worked was very similar to what a small business would be. And the only reason I think it operates differently today is because the volume has grown so big, but it's still just a small group of people at Disney Theatrical that are the people that are making the shows. So actually it was pretty much heaven. I had a lot to learn about working inside a corporate community where you build consensus rather than drive your point home. But that was good for me to learn that.
I certainly look, Broadway is booming now, better than it ever has been. And if you ask me to point to the one reason why it is, I might tell you that I think Disney was a big turning point with Beauty and the Beast and obviously the big shows that followed after, including the one that's still playing, The Lion King. Did you have any, one, do you agree with that? And two, did you have any idea while these shows were developing that we're going to turn a bit of a tide here. We're going to have a theater in Times Square. We're going to have global productions all over the world. Did you see that coming?
Well, first, I wasn't there when Beauty was developed and opened. And if you recall, Beauty was pretty reviled and not welcomed to town. And despite that cold shoulder, went on to be a very successful show. And when we took the production over, we realized that there was a global rollout. But if you really want to credit the person or people that created this model, you probably have to go back to Cameron McIntosh and Andrew Lloyd Webber, because they had, with the, quote, mega musicals of the 80s, the Phantoms, Cats, Les Mis, Saigon, they did that. They globalized the theater business. They created event musicals that had the capacity not just to be successful in one venue, but to have replica productions all over the world. And with that, they created the business model that American producers had not really yet taken advantage of. So when Disney did follow that path with Beauty and Lion King, that was our model. There's no question about it. But I think to properly say who created that model, you probably have to go back to the Cameron Andrew world and say, they created the modern theater business. I can tell you this, that if theater was really about mounting a show on Broadway and having a national tour, Disney would not be in that business. That's just not it doesn't move the needle. So as much as Michael loved Broadway, the business of Disney is a global business, Disney Theatrical, and that was created, as I said, I think, by Cameron and Andrew.
All right, let's get off the Disney stuff. Let's get more into you. So then you leave Disney and then you go back to being an independent. What was that?
Well, I didn't immediately make that turn. After being 10 years at Disney, my first thing was I don't want to work in the commercial theater for a while. So I went back to my roots, which were something to do with nonprofit, and I started a program that I was lucky enough to find a home for at Northwestern University called the American Music Theater Project. And the conceit was that we were going to build an institute that brought a really great student body and great facilities. And I mean, the faculty there ranges from, Tony winners all across the faculty to the professional writer and director that would come in and collaborate on a new piece that we could do with some professional actors and with some students. And so I founded that in, I guess, maybe 2004. And I moved my family back to Chicago from LA, where we were living when I worked at Disney, even though we were in the air most of the week. And I did that for 3 years, and we did 6 new musicals, and I really enjoyed teaching. I enjoyed mentoring. The work was almost the same work as I was doing at Disney. It was just on a completely smaller scale, where we really did the readings and workshops and development and took the time, which is what I love. But after about 3 years, the answer is yes. I think I said, boy, if I'm ever going to do this again, I better not be gone too long, because I'll get very cold very fast. And so, yes, I thought, how can I be in the business and do more or less what I did at Disney, even in a much more scaled back version? And to do that, I needed capital. And I was going to take on the model of only new musicals, because I actually think they're the only business of theater. They're the only place where, I mean, I suppose you can do 2 or 3 new plays a year, or a revival every 6, I mean, something like that. But with the way our producing units are put together and the way money is generated and how tight and difficult it is to make money, I actually personally don't see that anything but new musicals are viable for producers that need to get a hit. Like, if you need a hit to support your business, I think that's what you have to do. So
I have to comment and just say how insightful of a business comment that is about what producers are doing today. What I love about that is, look, we all want to do great theater. We all want to, that's what got you in the business, what got me in the business. But for those people looking to be a career producer, to be as smart as you were to be able to say, okay, look, if I want to do this, my time is limited, my resources are limited. I'm going to focus on the new musical, because that could give me the hit.
Well, I can also say it's the only real argument I could make to a speculative investor that it's a good place to put your money. Maybe it's different if you were to say, okay, we got Tom Hanks in a play, and you're going to get a 15% return over, and you kind of go, great. I mean, you're lucky if you're invited into that kind of project as a producer or an investor. But if you're a speculator, new musicals are the only place where you can, when it works, it works. I mean, you can roll out over years. I had a modest success with the Addams Family, and we had 5 production, and it's generating revenue. It'll be 600 productions this year in the United States in stock and amateur that at least continue to feed some money into the mother company. You don't get that if you're doing a revival, you know. So, but that became my model, and I thought I would try to pick a small number of high-quality projects that, and I define that as things I can get my hands on, because certain things I just can't get my hands on, 2, things that have a chance to surprise if they're done right, and 3, I would say things that feel a little bit against the grain, a little bit like it goes to the same notion of surprise, I think, and the unexpected. But I feel like these days on Broadway, unless you can kind of catch the world by surprise, it's hard to make noise. I mean, of course, if you make Hamilton, which does both, catches you by surprise, and it's extraordinary theater, well then, you know, you kind of really win the lottery. But I always felt like Lion King's a good example, which is, it certainly was a fabulous property, but in the hands of Julie Taymor, it became a surprise invention that everyone kind of had to see. I don't think that was necessarily true for Beauty, although in its moment, there had never been anything like that. So I think that gave it a lot of legs. To do that, I felt like I needed capital. So I formed a company with a couple of partners, and I did something quite unusual, but I didn't do it actually because I thought it was so smart. One of my partners thought it was very smart, a guy named David Fay, who runs the Bushnell Center in Hartford. And he and a guy named Mick Levitt and I formed a company. And we partnered with 5 nonprofit performing arts centers, big ones. The Bushnell, at the time was the Wang, but the City Center in Boston, the Pittsburgh CLO and Cultural Trust, the Kimmel Center in Philadelphia, and the Ordway in St. Paul. And they wrote substantial checks, and then 10 more nonprofit performing arts centers wrote less substantial checks. And then we raised an equal amount from the private sector and created a fund. And I sold myself, more or less, as the general partner. Instead of producing a play, I produced a development company. And the development company's job was then to take different projects and start from scratch and let the gestation take as long as it has to take and somehow come up with a winner. And obviously that's easier said than done, but I'm about 8 years into it, and I've produced 4 shows, 2 of which I started off Broadway, and neither one made the move to Broadway. And one was The Addams Family, which is a story of its own, and the other is American in Paris. So it's taken 8 years to have what I would call a sustaining financial success, whether or not, I mean, it's too soon to write the story on American in Paris, but it has the potential at this moment to be that. I mean, it isn't that, but you could see it could be that.
It seems to me like a movie model. You had a production company and a slate, if you will, early on of pictures or projects, and you developed them using your artistic acumen and everything you knew. And yeah, it looks like to me, I know you can't write the future right now on the show, but certainly it looks coming out of the box that there's global success. And we'll talk about that in a little bit in your future. And 1 out of 4, that would be pretty good for that slate. So it's working exactly the way you planned so far, it looks like. Sure. I'll knock on my conference table a little bit for you. Tell me, since you're talking about raising capital a bit, do you have how do you have a style on how you raise money from individual investors? Of course, it's the question I get asked the most from people looking to produce. How do you do it?
Well, first off, because I raised the money for development in the way I did, I didn't have to go for front money to investors. So that was the big, leg up. I could write a check. I could do what I wanted to do without using up my limited personal resources. When it comes to doing a show, like raising money to do the show itself, to be honest, I'm not, I show the people what we've got, and I hope that they get excited about it. And I don't think there's any big trick. I mean, the way our business works now that, if I was going to go out and raise money in $50,000 chunks, I could probably raise $1 million. Which means since the shows cost 10 times or more than that, we partner with other people who take on the role of producers. So they're either people who are savvy industry producers who write their own checks, or they're people in our industry that have built their reputation as picking good shows and have a pool of investors that they go to. So, it's not uncommon now for us to see 30 names above the title. And, it's not the way they did it in the David Merrick days, but it costs a lot more now. And it's our reality. And I've been very fortunate to have really wonderful people around me. And mostly they recognize, and I'm not trying to toot my horn, but I'm a real hands-on, in the trenches, don't do 4 things at once producer. And all they really want is to know that I'm open to listening and working my butt off. And I do on both accounts, and so I've had great partners who've supported me. And they come back in if they feel like you've got something they want to do.
I think you're 100% right on that. We did this survey of a bunch of investors a while ago, and one of the biggest complaint was not that they lost money, is that they didn't know they were losing money because the producer or their person that they were dealing with wasn't filling them in. And it sounds like you're the type of guy that is just open to, one, taking calls and listening to people and hearing them out and letting them know what's happening.
Yeah, we meet once a month with all the producers, and of course it's their job to talk to their individual investors. I tend to not dig into that world, but all our producing partners are part of the mix, and they know what's going on. And they're not running the show. They know that. That's the great thing, is you've got to have people that understand their role. And I've also brought certain of my co-producers in to play really important roles because they're good at things. You want to take advantage of that.
I think of it as like you're the chairman of the board and you have board members around you, and some board members may have relationships that you don't have.
Absolutely.
To explain. Okay, let's talk specifically about American Paris. American Paris was one of those 4 shows that you opened the company with. Was it on the site from the beginning 8 years ago? When did that bubble up?
5 years ago, I was asked if I would like to consider a Gershwin property, if I would meet the people who ran the Gershwin estate. And I said, sure. I had a lunch, and the subject of this piece came up. And I'd say, like most people, I knew very little about it. I knew it was a classic MGM film from somewhere 40s and 50s. I didn't pinpoint the year. I knew Gene Kelly was the magnificent central creative force. And I knew it used Gershwin music. And I did know it won an Oscar in 1950 for Best Picture, 6 Oscars. But asked me to tell you the story, I couldn't do that. So I said, it's a compelling title, of course, but the notion of just adapting a compelling title because it's a title, more often than not, if you don't have a really good reason for doing it, a creative approach, if there's not something that you say, I know how to do that now in a way that hasn't been done before, you're more likely going to end up with The Wedding Singers, and that's not a criticism of that. It's just really hard to take something that's a successful film and put that film on stage. You have to have something else that justifies the emotional reason, the creative reason, the now reason. So I went and watched the film. And my first reaction, I'm very good at this. I can watch things with no filter. I can just sit and watch the movie. And I kind of went, this movie is very shallow. This movie, you can love the dance sequences. It had this incredible 14-minute ballet that was really the defining piece of the film. But the story itself all the people seemed too old for the parts. There was a kind of core dramatic story that didn't make sense. There was no reason for a lot of the things that happened to happen. There was no emotional underlying reason. And then when we went back and watched it the second time, my partner Van Kaplan and I, we actually saw something that really moved us, which was by simply moving the story from 1950 to 1944 and allowing the end of World War II to impact every character and every decision, everything changed. So all of a sudden Lise, the female character, who in the movie is not a Jewish girl, and is living with Henri, a famous French Frank Sinatra type. Why she's living with him, why he's in love with her and she's not in love with him, none explained. But all of a sudden, if Henri is a younger man who isn't a star, but aspires to a life that includes music, but lives in a family that's been repressed by the war, and he and his family kept Lise safe as a Jewish girl during the war, all of a sudden her relationship to him and his to her make a lot of sense. And when Jerry meets Lise and falls in love with her, her obligation to Henri and the triangle that causes makes a lot of sense. So we were able to fairly quickly, with the help of Craig Lucas, who we went to see with the idea, the big idea, make it real. Set it in a real moment on the edge of the end of the war and how that war affected everyone's lives. So with that idea, we thought, now there's a way to do it. And then the second thing was, what do you do about the ballet? Because if the ballet had just been like a scene, you might have said, well, let's just go away from that. Let's just do a show. Let's do a show. But the ballet was kind of the soul of the film, and we felt there was no way to actually be responsible to the underlying material and run away from the ballet. But the ballet was kind of pasted on at the end. So our idea was that if there was going to be a musical about this, we had to actually run headfirst into the ballet, expand the ballet, create a language for the entire show that includes ballet and jazz and tap and Broadway, but ballet had to be the language. And if you're going to do world-class ballet, on Broadway, you need a world-class choreographer. And if you want dance to be the medium that the show exists within, you probably don't want a director that has a vision that is not dance-oriented, working with a choreographer that can give you some dances. You want the dance to define the entire show if it's going to culminate in something like a major ballet. So that shortened the list measurably. And so we went to the Gershwins with our choices of what we wanted to do, and they were reticent, quite naturally. Why did Chris Wheeldon direct it? Why? I understand him as the choreographer. Why would he be the director? And we all went into it with an open mind, and we developed the show over a period of time. And Chris said, I'm willing to go for it. Let's see if we can make it work and convince them. And if they're convinced, we'll do it. And if they're not convinced, I'll step aside or whatever.
So you did a workshop or some
We actually started
to get the rights.
Well, we did. We got the rights to enable us to hire Chris and Craig and all the things we needed to do. We needed to control it. But we did not have Chris approved when we started the process. He was approved as choreographer, and we went through a reading period, which took about, between rights and writing and all of that. Yeah, it took maybe 2 years to get through the reading phase. And then they were supportive, and, they believed in his vision, and then we did a full workshop because we needed, and Chris needed, to see the whole show. He'd never directed on Broadway before. I can go back and tell you why I think he was the guy, but he hadn't done this process. And so when we did a full workshop in October, November of 13, and that was definitive. You could the show wasn't done, but you could see what the show was going to be. And that's when everyone approved everything. That's when Chris said, I'm willing to go forward, because he wasn't sure he could do it either. It was the only time in my life I've ever worked on a project where I knew there was no guaranteed outcome at all. I don't mean even, there's no guaranteed success outcome ever. But there was no outcome that we were even going to do this show because the team wasn't approved and the director wasn't sure he could direct it. And we didn't know if it would work when he put it on its feet. And I went into it with a very open heart, probably because I thought the business was so hard that if we just don't go for it, we'll never know. And maybe it'll be the last thing I ever do, or maybe not. And it came together.
Let's hope, if it's the last thing, I certainly hope it's not. You're working on it for a number of decades. But then you develop a show, you do this workshop, and then you decide to take it, quote unquote, out of town. Now I'm a big believer in trying to find new places in this country to take it out of town and try it out. You took yours across the Atlantic and actually did your tryout in Paris. How did that come about?
Well, on one level, that's insane because you're doing an English language musical in a French-speaking country overseas, in a particular country that has not much of a history of a love for American musicals.
Or anything American, by that.
By that, that's correct. The answer is that I knew that this title, which felt like a revival, probably couldn't command the amount of money in capitalization that the show was going to require if I did it entirely commercially. So in my business plan, I didn't want to capitalize at $15 million or $16 million. I actually, didn't think I could raise it. I might have after the workshop, but I still think it wouldn't have been a good investment at that number. So in order to keep the number closer to the 10, 11 area, I knew we needed to partner with somebody. And obviously the natural partners are the best nonprofit theaters, in America. ART was interested, the Goodman was very interested, ACT wanted to do it. So I had a lot of people who were kind of interested, but I was introduced to a fellow named Jean-Luc Chopin by the Gershwins because Jean-Luc was also trying to get the rights to do the show in Paris. Now, backing up, Jean-Luc Chopin was a special advisor to Michael Eisner during the years that I worked at Disney. So when I was, quote unquote, introduced to him, we knew each other. And Jean-Luc had become the artistic director of the Théâtre du Châtelet in Paris. And at the Theatre du Châtelet over the last 10 years, he began introducing the canon of American musicals, predominantly just the top. They've never had them. So Sondheim, Rodgers and Hammerstein, West Side Story, and he would do 1 or 2 a year for 10 to 14 performances in English. He produces everything in the original language. Most of the cast would come from England, pretty much. The design teams and the directors would be from England because they don't really have that culture in Paris to do this. And little by little, it caught on, and the French audience started to grow, and the runs got a little longer. And he felt that he was ready, actually, to try something that had never been done, which was a world premiere. Now, I don't think he would have done a world premiere of a musical that no one had ever heard of. It didn't hurt that this was called An American in Paris. But it was just kind of a natural thing. It was hard. Culturally, there were challenges. A big one was we almost didn't do it because they just couldn't get their arms around the concept of previews. So literally, they wanted the first performance to be the press performance, and we just had to walk away, and we separated for about 3 months until we found a way to bridge the gap, and they figured it out. But because there were certain things you could live with, but certain things you couldn't. It's one thing to have a text that's not in the local language, which meant we weren't going to learn everything we needed to learn until we got back to previews in New York. But it was another thing to be reviewed by the world media on your first run-through, so to speak. Because I don't know how many times you've done new musicals, but usually the first preview is the first run-through. So, so that was important. But other than that, it became a completely magical experience. Imagine we rehearsed in America. It's our Broadway company. We brought 75 people to Paris. They funded just as they would have funded their own show in that period for what, just like the nonprofits kind of work. His budget for doing a 3-week run of a new musical or any musical, a revival, in that period would have been X dollars. And he was willing to put that into the show as an enhancement, so to speak, not as an investment, but as a nonprofit does. And that difference of that money helped us be able to fund the entire show. We built the show in Paris. That was their contribution. We built the costumes and the set. We built it for the palace. We knew we were going to the palace before we started building in Paris. And imagine the experience of the 75, 80 people that get on the plane together and go over to Paris for 3 months to make a musical. So it was magical and hugely successful. To Chris Wheeldon's credit, he didn't buy the laudatory reviews as the work being finished. I suppose hearing from some good friends and from us that we weren't finished was also influential. But the reality is that we did get out of it what we wanted to get out of it. And we made enormous changes between Paris and New York, even coming off of very good reviews there. And then came in, began previews, and still had a lot of work to do. But, again, knock on wood, during previews, we did the work. And those were harrowing moments because you work on something for a really long time and you're 2 weeks from having the critics come in and certain scenes are still not working. So
it's funny you talk about that preview period because that was my next question really for you is I remember the moment, and this happens I find every season when shows are happening. There's a moment you can feel it, whether I hear it, when you know a show is working, you just feel it and hear from so many people. And obviously you start to see it in the box office. And I remember there was a moment, all of a sudden, bam, tickets started to move like crazy. I saw it in the grosses, but I would hear people saying, American in Paris. Every ad meeting I went to, what's selling? No one's selling tickets to anything except American in Paris is moving a ton of tickets. Did it feel like that to you? Did all of a sudden things start to snap into place?
Yes, it did. We had about a $5 million advance, which was pretty good. I think it was including unpaid groups, but when we started previews. And by the time, I guess the Tony nominations, right when they came out, we had gone up to about 12. So that's a pretty big jump in, so it was only 6 weeks, but between that period. So yes, I think what happened was you did feel it. You felt it in the theater. Although I would tell you that the first 2 weeks of previews, we were in previews. I mean, every night there was uncertainty, and there were many changes every day. And to the credit of our actors, some of whom had not ever been through this process before, they took them. But when it tipped, you could feel it. You could feel the audience lifting up, and it's very special when that happens.
So you go from this show that tries out way out of town. You come in still uncertain, and then all of a sudden things blow up. In addition to grosses going a little crazy, you get a glowing set of notices on top of that. And then all of a sudden you find yourself in this position. You turn around and you're the big hit of the season. And then what happens, and yes, I'm going to bring up what I'm sure is probably a very sensitive subject for you, you become the favorite to win the Best Musical Tony Award, where people like Ben Brantley is predicting that you're going to win. I'm predicting you're going to win. I told you were going to win, frankly, when I saw you at the show. And everyone else thinks it's a lock. How did that make you feel as when all of a sudden you were the favorite?
Well, I'll tell you this. We were under the radar for a very long time. When we were in Paris and they were writing articles about the spring season, we didn't get mentioned. And we thought, how great. And so little by little, we were starting to be more and more on the radar. And I thought, oh, this is just perfect. And it's kind of true that when we opened, we were still kind of the unexpected success of the season. But then our grosses were really high. And it was a very strong season. There were 4 nominees that were uniquely different than each other. And all of a sudden we were the front runner. And I think that was not a comfortable place to be. It's like you're the horse that you're on the rail and you're leading, but someone's coming up on your tail. And we never know these things when we're in them. I mean, my Monday morning quarterbacking is that people kept saying that it was Fun Home and American Paris that were going up against each other. And I think in retrospect, it was Fun Home and the rest of the field that was going against each other, because I think there was something, besides Fun Home being a very beautiful musical, there was something incredibly compelling, brave about the subject matter, about the journey Fun Home had taken, about what was going on in our culture. There was just something that said, and it had original music, of course, which we did not have, which I think is a criteria to be best musical. I think you're going to win some votes if you've got original score. So I think what happened ultimately was that was a show to believe in. And I think they had enough believers, and I think the rest of us probably split up the other votes, and we'll never know if you win or lose by 10 votes or 100 votes. But I think in retrospect, I don't know if you'd say this. Would you say this? In retrospect, now can you see that was going to happen?
Yeah, I can. I mean, I actually felt at the beginning of a shift that last week. I always say during the Tony campaign, it's the last 7 days you can feel something happening on the street. And I certainly felt there was a Fun Home movement at that point at the last second. I feel like when people are filling out their ballots, they're more willing to talk about it with people about what they're voting for, and that you could hear that. So I do think that was probably it. And look, I had a contender in the race too. Yes. I had to visit, so I do think it was part of that field that was pulling away. But I still didn't think it would happen. I still didn't think there was enough. I thought that what I witnessed myself personally in that theater and looked around and seeing what everyone else witnessed, your production is breathtakingly beautiful and leaves you with your mouth open so many times in the show that I thought it was going to happen.
Well, it's where competition isn't really fair, because I would also say that the visit was very successful at being what it wanted to be, as Something Rotten is very successful being what it wants to be. You had 4 shows. I mean, if we were facing off American in Paris against The King and I, against Billy Elliot, now you got like big musicals, who do you like better? But these were such uniquely different shows, which I think, I heard your podcast with Ben, he said he was optimistic about the season, that he felt like the season turned out pretty good. And I think that's true too. I don't think anybody knew the season was going to be very good 4 months ago. And now all of a sudden let's look at it this way too. Sorry for the visit and sorry for Should Have Been You, but I think there's 5 musicals, including King and I, that have come out of the season running, doing grosses over $1 million, although Fun Home's less, but it can't gross $1 million. So that's a very successful season. And I think that says a lot about the diversity of the community and the openness, and I think we needed a season like this.
I think you're 100% right. Even Finding Neverland doesn't get any nominations. It's doing $1 million.
Exactly.
A lot of big hits were put on the boards this season. In looking at that period, that Tony period, do you think these Tony campaigns that producers wage now, do you think they have an effect? Do you think there is, every ad agency, you sit down with the nominee, okay, let's talk about that Tony campaign. We need to do $1 million. Do you think that actually works? Did you have a campaign?
Every team has diverse opinions itself about what it is. I'd say yes. I think there is we try not to use the C word, it's not a campaign. And truthfully, the most important thing actually is to view it as a way to make your show popular. Because what do you really want to do is you want to sell tickets. You want the audience to be able to learn who you are and why they should care about you. How many of our biggest hits were not Tony winners? I mean, Kevin took an ad to explain that, but you can even go to other, look at right now. I mean, look at Wicked, look at Aladdin, Beautiful. These are shows that didn't win, and there's plenty of them that become the successful shows out of the season. So winning the Tony isn't the only key to success, although it does make I think for us, had we won, I think we might have taken off like a rocket. I think it would have made a difference. A year from now, I hopefully will be able to tell you we came out the same place anyway. But back to your question, I think there is an expectation that you're telling a story. And I think the story you can tell is the story that's authentic. And I can't tell Fun Home's story. I can't tell Something Rotten's story. So I have to tell our story. And the thing about our show was that it was a real labor of love, and it was done in a very beautiful, classy way. And critics liked the show, audiences liked the show, and I just needed to communicate that to the voters as best I could. The one unique thing we chose to do was a art book that we had this artist that we asked to join our team, more or less. Her name is Andrea Silby. And she came in and we just gave her carte blanche to draw. And she drew hundreds of pictures from rehearsals all the way into production. And we made a beautiful book of that, and we sent the book out to everybody. So is that hypey? I don't think so. I think we made the choice that we were the front runner. We were having good grosses. The best thing to do was be elegant and be tasteful. And, whatever it was, our story, I think I can't say worked or not worked. We worked for us. I don't think you could be absent in that campaign. Look, the craziest things that we do is spend $250,000 to perform on the Tony Awards. Let's figure out a way that when you get that great success and you get nominated for a Tony, you don't have to pay your own way to go to the party, We spend a lot of money just to have Tony night happen. That's a lot. That's big. That's a big thing we all have to do.
I'm trying to get the producers of the Tony Awards on the podcast in the coming months. We're going to ask them that specific question.
Those guys are fantastic, but I don't think they're the ones who make that decision.
They're not, unfortunately. Well, obviously, despite having not taken home a trophy that night, you're doing unbelievably well over there, and I'm sure that will continue, and I'm, again, sure that tours are in the future.
Yeah, and we got 4, and I'll boast and say that we won the Outer Critics Circle Award and the Drama League Award for Best Musical. We won over 20 awards this season. So, you know what awards we got? We didn't get the big one. But we got awards, and you're right, we're doing good business. And, as a producer, I'm proud of my show. I am so in love with what I get to see standing in the back of the theater and watching audiences react, I've never had that experience at that level as an individual. I had it with Disney a little bit. I've had it with plays in Chicago, but for being here in the big time, this is like the moment of my career. So I'm very grateful. And you invited me on your show. So what more could I ask?
What kind of advice do you have for the kid that may be in Chicago right now that's saying one day I want to be a big Broadway producer? What's the path now? Years later, after you took a very unique path, what would you tell that kid to do?
I would say that unless you're independently wealthy, you better have another thing you do besides produce that gives you your economic continuity. Because the thing you need on your side is time and enough of the ability to marshal resources on a project-by-project basis to be able to bring something to fruition. And if you're working with the desperation of how do I pay my bills at the same time, it's almost impossible. So how many guys started as booking agents? How many people started as, running a theater? Or you have to do something else. You just have to do something else if you're not independently wealthy. So I would say embrace the industry. See where you could fit in. See where you can do well inside the industry. Make yourself valuable in that way. Maybe even build a business, whatever it is that you can do while you're also producing, because as the adage goes about producers, you can't make a living, though you can make a killing. So your job is to stick around long enough till you get a chance to make the killing. And then at that point, you sometimes can transition and live off of, one successful show can keep a company going for 10 years while you're doing other projects. That's a wonderful thing, but you need that first success to get a leg up in the business.
Okay, and now the last question, which is perfect because you worked for Disney at one point. It's my Aladdin genie question. Imagine right now that the genie pops into my office, knocks on my conference room door, comes in and says, Stuart, you've done such a wonderful job. I've seen American Paris and it's breathtakingly beautiful, and I want to reward you for that. I'm going to give you a wish. What is the one thing, Stuart, that drives you so crazy, that keeps you up at night, that if only I could fix this on Broadway, if only this would be different, I would sleep better? What would be the one thing you would ask that genie to change in the snap of a finger?
I would like there to be I'd like each theater to have 50% more seats and more comfortable seats and more legroom and better backstage facilities. I'd like everything about our venues to be improved for the quality of the work and the people who work in them, and so that as much as I love the intimacy, we need more seats so that we aren't forced to continue to raise ticket prices, and a show can, live on Saturday night without having to live on Wednesday and Tuesday night, because it just, you can't sell enough tickets. I think the biggest problem plaguing our business is what number we break even at each week. So, the landlords don't have much patience for shows that are marginal. So you really have to make it. It's feast or famine. And that's not the best.
We've lost the middle of the market, I say all the time. 10, 20, 30 years ago, a show could hang on. Theater owners wouldn't be nudging them out the door and inviting something else in if it was just doing okay.
You have to wonder, really, how there's so much capital that wants to be invested in the theater. Because it's not like the successes overall, the number of hits are greater. I mean, still more money is lost every year than is made every year, I imagine, at least taking a season-by-season basis of new shows. But there's just a big community that wants to do it, and the theater owners generally have their pick. And so I think, another thing would have been to have more theaters, have Manhattan add a few blocks to each end of the island so that we can add some more theaters, because it's a very closed communities in terms of seating capacities and the footprint of the building and the number of buildings.
I'll have to get de Blasio on the podcast, see what I can do. Well, luckily for you, you're experiencing anything but marginal success over there at the Palace. So congratulations on that. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. Thanks to all of you for listening. We got some very cool people coming up. I will reach out to de Blasio and we'll see if we can get him on. I don't know. I doubt it. Tune in next time. Thanks so much. Thanks again for listening, everybody. Don't forget to check out didhelikeit.com and subscribe so you can be the first to know whether the New York Times liked the latest show or not. And it's an app in the iTunes store. Download it today. That's didhelikeit.com.